He had been sleeping behind the old bakery for almost 3 months. The spot was narrow, just wide enough for a thin blanket and a small backpack that carried everything he owned. At night, the brick wall held a little warmth from the ovens inside. In the early mornings, when the first trays of bread were rolled out, the smell of fresh dough would drift through the alley and wake him before the sun did. Most people who passed that alley never noticed him. They walked quickly, eyes fixed ahead, coffee cups in hand, busy with their own thoughts. If someone did glance his way, it was often just for a second. Quick look, a quiet judgment. Then they moved on. He did not blame them anymore. At first, he used to feel the sting. The way people tightened their grip on their bags. The way they crossed the street. The way they avoided eye contact as if he might ask for something. After a while, the feeling became dull, like an old bruise that no longer hurt but never fully faded. His clothes were worn but clean. He washed them himself at a public restroom sink late at night. He kept his beard trimmed with a small pair of scissors he found in a donation box. There was something careful about him, something that did not quite match the picture people had already decided in their minds. During the day, he usually sat near the corner of a busy street where a small café stood. The café had outdoor tables and soft music that floated out whenever the door opened. Sometimes he would close his eyes and listen. Not just listen, but follow the music closely, like someone tracing a path they once knew by heart. When there were no songs playing, he made his own. His fingers often tapped lightly on his knees or on the bench beside him. Soft patterns. Slow rhythms. If someone watched closely, they might notice how steady his hands were. How his fingers moved with purpose, not randomly. Sometimes he would tap a melody so clear that, if there had been keys under his hands instead of cold wood, it would have filled the street. But no one noticed that either. In the afternoons, the café grew louder. Laughter, plates clinking, phones ringing. Students came in with laptops. Workers came in for a quick break. Tourists stopped for photos. He stayed in his usual place, never blocking the way, never asking for attention. If someone dropped a coin into the paper cup near his feet, he nodded with a quiet thank you. He was not always this quiet. There was a time when his hands touched polished keys instead of rough benches. A time when people leaned forward to hear him play instead of leaning away to avoid him. But those memories felt like scenes from another person's life. They belonged to a version of him that seemed far away now. Some evenings, when the street grew calm and the sky turned soft orange, he would look through the café window. In one corner, near the wall, there stood an old upright piano. It was not new. The wood was scratched. One of the legs looked slightly uneven. A small sign sat on top of it that read, "Play me." Children often ran up to it first. They pressed random keys and laughed at the loud sounds. Sometimes a teenager tried to show off a song half-remembered from lessons. The notes were often shaky, uneven. People clapped politely anyway. He never went inside to touch it. Not because he didn't want to, but because he knew how quickly kindness could turn into suspicion. A man like him walking into a cafe and sitting at the piano would raise questions before it raised music. He had learned that lesson more than once, so he stayed outside. One cold afternoon, a group of young men stood near him, waiting for their drinks. They were laughing loudly, joking about something on a phone screen. One of them glanced at him and nudged the other. "Hey," one said casually, not unkind but not kind either. "Do you play?" He looked up slowly. "Play what?" "The piano. There's one inside. Bet you could make a song for us." The others chuckled. It was not a serious offer. It was the kind of suggestion people make when they expect nothing to happen. He gave a small smile and shook his head. "Not today." They shrugged and went inside. But after they left, he found his fingers tapping again. This time the rhythm was stronger, clearer. His right hand moved as if searching for higher notes, while his left marked a steady pattern. His eyes were not on the street anymore. They were somewhere else entirely. He remembered the weight of real keys under his hands. The way a room could change in a single breath when the first chord rang out. He remembered practicing for hours, repeating the same passage until it felt like part of his own heartbeat. Life had not collapsed all at once. It rarely does. It had happened slowly. A missed opportunity. A job that ended. A bill that could not be paid. Place that was lost. Each step small on its own. Together they led him here. He never told anyone the full story. Not because it was a secret, but because no one asked. As the weeks passed, more people began to recognize him as part of the street itself. The bakery owner sometimes handed him leftover rolls at closing time. A woman from the flower shop greeted him each morning. A delivery driver once gave him an old pair of gloves. Still, most people only saw the surface. They did not see the way he studied the café piano from across the street, noticing which keys stuck slightly when pressed. They did not see how he counted the beats of every song that drifted through the open door. They did not see how carefully he guarded his hands, flexing his fingers each night as if preparing for something important. One evening, rain began to fall without warning. The tables outside the café were quickly folded and carried in. Customers rushed inside, shaking water from their coats. He stayed under the small awning by the alley, watching the reflections of streetlights in the puddles. Through the café window he saw someone sit at the piano. An older man this time. The melody that followed was slow and gentle. Not perfect, but full of feeling. He closed his eyes. Without thinking, his hands began to move again, this time in the air. His fingers curved slightly, pressing invisible keys. His shoulders relaxed. His breathing slowed. If anyone had been watching closely, they might have seen the difference in his face. The quiet focus. The calm strength. For those few minutes, he was not a homeless man sitting in an alley. He was simply a musician. When the song ended, applause filled the café. The sound carried out into the street. He opened his eyes and lowered his hands slowly, as if placing something fragile back into a box. The rain stopped as quickly as it had started. Night came and the street grew quiet. He lay down on his blanket, staring at the narrow strip of sky above him. Cars passed in the distance. Somewhere, a door slammed. He folded his hands over his chest and flexed his fingers one last time before sleep. Tomorrow would likely be the same as today. The same corner. The same looks. The same quiet tapping on wooden benches. He did not know that soon, everything would change. For now, he was just another man the city had forgotten. But the music inside him had not forgotten who he was. The next afternoon felt different, though he could not explain why. The air was warmer than usual, and the café was busier than it had been all week. A small crowd had gathered inside for a local event. Someone had hung simple string lights near the ceiling. The door stayed open longer than usual, and laughter spilled out onto the street. He sat in his usual place, back against the wall, watching without staring. He had learned how to observe quietly. A person can see a lot when they are not the center of attention. Around sunset, a delivery truck pulled up in front of the café. Two workers stepped out and carried something large from the back. It was wrapped in plastic and tied with tape. People inside turned their heads with curiosity. He leaned forward slightly. When the plastic was removed, he saw it clearly. It was another piano. Not a grand one. Not shiny or new, but different from the old upright inside. This one looked older, heavier, with chipped paint and missing pieces along the edges. A few keys were yellowed and uneven. One corner had a crack running down the wood. The workers placed it near the café entrance, outside on the sidewalk. Someone from inside laughed. "That old thing still works?" Another voice answered. "We found it in storage. Might as well use it for tonight." The owner of the café stepped outside and pressed a few keys. The sound that came out was rough. One note stuck. Another buzzed with a strange vibration. A couple of keys made no sound at all. "It's not perfect," the owner said with a shrug, "but it's fine for fun." People seemed amused. Some pulled out their phones. A few joked about who would be brave enough to try it first. He watched every movement carefully. His eyes stayed on the keys. Broken, out of tune, missing pieces. Still, it was a piano. As the evening went on, different people took turns pressing random notes. The sounds were messy and uneven. Laughter followed each failed attempt to play a real song. It became part of the entertainment. One young man stepped up and loudly announced he would perform a masterpiece. He hit the keys with exaggerated drama. The crowd laughed even louder when the instrument responded with strange, off-pitch sounds. Someone pointed toward the alley where he sat. "Hey, get him to try," a voice called out. He froze. At first, he pretended not to hear. He kept his eyes down. Another voice joined in. "Yeah, come on. Let's see what you've got." The tone was playful, but there was an edge to it. The kind of tone people use when they expect a joke. A few heads turned toward him now. Some curious. Some amused. Some simply following the crowd. He felt the heat rise in his face. The cafe owner hesitated, then looked at him. "You want to give it a try?" There was a pause. For a moment, the street felt very quiet, even though it was not. He could have shaken his head again. He could have stayed where he was. That would have been easier. But something inside him stirred. A quiet voice that had been silent for too long. He slowly stood up. A few people clapped lightly, already smiling as if the show had begun. He walked toward the piano, each step steady but heavy. He was aware of the phones now. At least 3 were pointed in his direction. Recording. He reached the bench and paused. Up close, the damage was worse than he thought. 2 white keys were chipped. 1 black key leaned slightly to the side. Dust filled the narrow spaces between them. The pedals looked loose. Someone in the crowd whispered loudly, "This is going to be good." He heard the laughter. He sat down. The bench wobbled. He adjusted it slightly. His hands hovered above the keys but did not touch them yet. For a second, doubt rushed through him. What if his fingers no longer remembered? What if the broken keys defeated him? What if they were right to laugh? He closed his eyes. The noise around him faded just a little. He placed his fingers gently on the keys. The first note rang out sharp and uneven. A few people chuckled immediately. He pressed another key. This one buzzed strangely. More laughter. He kept his face calm. Inside, he was not hearing the broken sounds. He was mapping the instrument, testing it, learning which keys responded and which ones failed. His fingers moved lightly, exploring. He shifted his hand slightly to avoid the silent key. Then he tried again. This time, instead of random notes, he played a simple pattern. Slow, careful, adjusting his touch so the louder keys did not overpower the softer ones. The crowd's laughter softened. He listened closely to the strange tuning. The notes were not perfectly aligned, but there was still harmony hidden within them. He just had to find it. He changed the rhythm. The melody began to form. At first, people were unsure whether it was an accident. A few still smiled, waiting for a mistake. But he did not stop. He leaned slightly forward, shoulders relaxed, hands moving with quiet confidence now. His fingers avoided the broken keys without hesitation, as if he had known this piano for years. The uneven sounds blended together in a surprising way. What had felt broken moments ago now carried feeling. Conversations in the background began to fade. One of the phones slowly lowered. He added depth with his left hand, steady and strong, building a bass under the melody. Even with missing notes, he found ways to fill the space. He adjusted pressure, timing, spacing. The instrument was still flawed, but the music was not. A woman near the door stopped mid-sip and stared. A young boy stepped closer, eyes wide. The laughter was gone now. In its place was silence. Not the awkward kind, the listening kind. He let the melody rise higher, carefully stepping around the damaged notes like someone walking across stones in a river. His movements were natural, almost effortless. The broken piano no longer felt like a joke. It felt like a challenge he had accepted. Someone whispered, "Wait, he's actually good." Another voice answered softly, "No, he's really good." The crowd shifted closer. He opened his eyes briefly and saw the change in their faces. The amusement had faded. In its place was surprise, respect, even a little disbelief. But he did not focus on them. He focused on the music. The final notes of the piece came gently, slower than before. He let them hang in the air, even with their imperfect tuning. Then he lifted his hands. For a split second, no one moved. Then applause burst out, louder than expected. Not mocking, not playful, real. He blinked, almost confused. The same people who had expected a joke were now clapping with honest excitement. A few people stood. Someone said, "Play another one." He hesitated. The phones were still there, but now they were steady, focused differently. Not waiting for failure, waiting for more. He had only planned to prove a small point to himself. He had not planned for this. The cafe owner stepped forward slowly. "I didn't know," he began, then stopped, shaking his head with a small smile. "Go on." The crowd nodded. He looked down at the broken piano again. Just minutes ago it had been an object of humor. Now it felt like a door that had quietly opened. He placed his hands on the keys once more. This time, there was no laughter at the first note. Only silence. And listening. The street that had ignored him for months was now watching him with new eyes. What began as a joke had shifted into something no one had expected. Not even him. He did not rush into the second song. He let the silence settle first. Felt different now. The air around him was no longer filled with quiet laughter or low whispers. It was steady. Waiting. People who had been halfway out the door slowly stepped back inside. Those who had been scrolling on their phones were now holding them still. He pressed one key softly, testing the mood again. The note came out slightly flat, but this time no one reacted. They were listening beyond the sound. He began with a slow melody, one that carried more emotion than speed. His hands moved gently at first, almost careful, like someone touching something fragile. The broken keys were still there. The missing sounds were still there. But now he understood the piano better. He knew which notes to avoid and which ones could still sing. As he played, something shifted inside him. The street disappeared. The cafe lights blurred. The crowd faded. In his mind, he was back in a quiet room from years ago. A small studio with tall windows. The walls were lined with faded paint. There was an old clock that ticked loudly when the room fell silent. In that room, he had once practiced for hours every day. Not because someone forced him. Not because he needed applause. But because he loved the way music made the world feel softer. He remembered the weight of those days. The focus. The hope. His fingers moved with more confidence now. The melody grew stronger. Even the damaged notes seemed to blend into the feeling instead of fighting it. A man near the front crossed his arms at first, skeptical. But slowly his posture relaxed. A young girl who had been whispering to her mother stopped speaking completely. Her eyes were fixed on the moving hands. The music was no longer simple background sound. It had shape. It had direction. He shifted into a deeper tone, pressing the lower keys with steady rhythm. The broken piano trembled slightly under his touch, but he adjusted without hesitation. Years of training, practice, and instinct guided his hands. Outside the cafe, more people had gathered. They could not see clearly what was happening inside, but they could hear enough to know it was not ordinary. One of the young men who had first called him over stood near the wall, quiet now. His earlier smile had faded into something else, something closer to respect. The melody rose higher. He allowed it to grow fuller, adding gentle variations, small changes that showed skill beyond casual playing. Even with the missing keys, he filled the gaps naturally. He used pauses wisely, letting the silence speak between notes. There was no sign of struggle on his face, only focus. But inside, emotions were rising. It had been a long time since he had played for people who truly listened. A long time since his hands had felt this alive. He moved into a passage that required more speed. A risky choice on such a broken instrument. For a brief second, one key stuck again, producing a harsh sound. A few people winced softly. He did not stop. He adjusted instantly, skipping the faulty note, weaving around it as if it had never been part of the plan. The mistake disappeared into the flow. The crowd noticed. They saw not just talent but control. A quiet murmur spread through the room. "How is he doing that?" someone whispered. Another voice answered softly, "He's trained." The word lingered in the air. Trained. It changed the way they saw him. He slowed the pace again, returning to a softer theme. This time, there was warmth in the music, a sense of longing, as if the notes carried pieces of his own story without using words. He thought of the nights he had spent alone under the open sky, the cold mornings, the quiet hunger, the looks from strangers. All of it seemed to flow into the music, not in anger, but in honesty. Music had always been the one place where he did not have to explain himself. The melody softened further, almost like a whisper. No one moved. Even the street outside felt still. When he reached the final stretch of the piece, he let the notes stretch slightly longer than usual. He gave them space to breathe. Then, with one last gentle chord, he ended. The silence that followed was deep. It lasted only a few seconds, but it felt longer. Then applause filled the café again. Not loud and wild this time. Strong. Steady. Some people stood without realizing it. Others shook their heads in disbelief. He sat still for a moment, hands resting lightly on his lap. He did not smile widely or bow dramatically. He simply looked at the piano, as if thanking it for holding together. The cafe owner stepped closer. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked, his voice softer now. He hesitated. The question felt heavier than expected. "A long time ago," he answered quietly. "That wasn't just for fun," the owner said. "That was real." He gave a small nod. One of the young men who had first called out to him stepped forward. "I'm sorry," he said almost awkwardly. "We didn't know." He looked at him calmly. "It's okay." And he meant it. Because in that moment, something had shifted not just in the room, but inside him too. For months he had felt invisible, reduced to the surface people saw. Tonight, through broken keys and uneven sound, he had shown something deeper. The phones were still recording, but now they captured something unexpected. A man who had been overlooked, a talent that had been hidden in plain sight, a reminder that people are more than what they appear to be. Someone near the back called out again. "One more!" Laughter followed, but it was warm now. He glanced at the piano. It was worn, imperfect, slightly damaged. In some strange way he felt connected to it. Both of them had been dismissed. Both of them still had music left. He placed his fingers back on the keys. This time he chose something brighter. The notes danced lightly despite their flaws. The melody carried hope instead of longing. He allowed himself to enjoy it now. Not just perform, but feel. A few people began to sway gently. The young girl near the front smiled widely. The cafe that had once been just a background place in his day had become something else entirely. A stage. A second chance. As the final notes of the third piece rang out, he felt something he had not felt in a long time. Belonging. When the applause rose again, it was no longer about surprise. It was about admiration. He stood slowly from the bench. For a second, he thought about returning quietly to his usual spot by the alley. But the room was no longer the same, and neither was he. The broken piano had done more than make sound. It had reminded him of who he had always been. Not just a man on the street, but a musician. He did not leave after the applause. For a moment, he simply stood there beside the broken piano, unsure what to do next. The attention felt strange. Not uncomfortable, but unfamiliar. People were looking at him in a new way now. Not with pity. Not with amusement. With curiosity. The cafe owner pulled a chair closer and sat down near him. "You don't just know a few songs," he said gently. "You've studied this." He looked at the floor for a second before answering. "Yes," he said quietly. A long time ago, a small circle had formed around them. No one was rushing to leave anymore. The evening event had almost been forgotten. The broken piano had become the center of the room. "Where did you learn?" someone asked. He hesitated again. Talking about music through sound had always been easier than explaining it with words. But something in the room felt safe now. The laughter from earlier was gone. The teasing tone had disappeared. "I started when I was a child," he said slowly. "There was a piano in the house, old but working. I used to sit there for hours." He could see it clearly in his mind. A small living room, curtains that let in soft afternoon light, a piano placed near the wall, slightly out of tune but full of life. He remembered reaching the keys with small hands, pressing them carefully, amazed that one touch could create sound. My parents believed music was important, he continued. They didn't have much, but they made sure I had lessons. The people listening grew quieter. I practiced every day, before school, after school, weekends. He smiled faintly. Sometimes I complained, but I never stopped. One of the young men from earlier asked softly, "Did you play anywhere big?" He let out a slow breath. "Yes," he answered, and just like that, the room leaned in closer. There were competitions, small concerts, community halls. He paused, choosing simple words. I wasn't famous, but I was building something. He remembered standing on small stages, the bright lights warming his face, the quiet coughs from the audience before a performance, the way his heart would race before the first note, then calm down once the music began. Music had once felt like a clear path in front of him. So what happened? The cafe owner asked carefully. The question did not carry judgment, only honest curiosity. He rested his hand on the edge of the broken piano. Life, he said simply. There was no dramatic pause, no heavy explanation, just one word. But he knew that was not enough. I got older. Responsibilities came. Bills. Work. I took a job that wasn't music. I told myself it was temporary. He gave a small shrug. Temporary became permanent. A few people nodded. They understood that part. I still played, he added. At night. On weekends. But less and less. He remembered the slow change. How practice turned into occasional playing. How occasional playing turned into months of silence. Then I lost my job, he continued quietly. I thought I would find another quickly. I didn't. He did not go into detail. He did not talk about the stress or the long days searching for work. He did not describe the difficult choices. He kept it simple. I fell behind, he said. 1 month became 2, then 3. I lost the apartment. No one interrupted him. I sold things, he added. Furniture. Books. His voice softened slightly. The piano was the last to go. The words hung in the air. Someone near the back whispered, "That must have been hard." He nodded once. It felt like losing a part of myself, he admitted. He had not spoken that sentence out loud before. The broken piano in front of him suddenly seemed symbolic. Worn, chipped, slightly damaged, but still capable of music. He looked at the keys again. For a while I didn't play at all, he said. I didn't want to remember what I had lost. The cafe felt smaller now, more personal. A woman near the front wiped her eye quietly. But music doesn't really leave you, he continued. It waits. He flexed his fingers slowly as he spoke. When I ended up on the street, I had nothing. No instrument, no space, just time. He glanced toward the window that faced the alley. I started tapping rhythms on benches, on walls, on my knees, just to keep my hands alive. The young girl from earlier looked down at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. I would stand outside places like this, he said gently, listening. The cafe owner shook his head slightly in disbelief. And you never came in? He gave a small smile. I didn't think anyone would want me near the piano. There was a short silence. The weight of that statement settled over the group. The same people who had laughed earlier now looked uncomfortable, not because they felt attacked, but because they realized how quickly they had judged. One of them spoke up. We shouldn't have. He raised a hand softly. It's okay, he repeated. And again he meant it, because tonight had changed something. The cafe owner stood up slowly. You know, he said, looking around at the crowd, this old piano was meant to be a joke tonight. Something silly. He gestured toward the chipped wood. Turns out it was the best part of the evening. Light laughter followed, but it was warm. He looked at the instrument once more. It's not as broken as it seems, he said quietly. The owner smiled. Neither are you. That sentence caught him off guard. He blinked and looked away for a moment, taking it in. For months, he had carried the silent belief that he was damaged beyond repair, that the world had moved on without him. Yet here he was, playing, being heard. A young man stepped forward again, holding his phone. "I recorded everything," he said. "I hope that's okay." He nodded slowly. "It should be seen," the young man added. "People should see this." He was not sure what that meant exactly, but he felt no fear about it. The cafe owner turned to him once more. "Would you consider coming back tomorrow evening? I can have this piano tuned a little. Or maybe we move the one from inside out here. You could play properly." The offer was simple, but it felt enormous. He had not been invited anywhere in a long time. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I don't want to cause trouble." "You're not trouble," the owner replied firmly. "You're talent." The word echoed softly in his mind. Talent. He had not heard that word directed at him in years. The crowd slowly began to thin as the night grew later. But people left differently than they had arrived. Some shook his hand. Others offered quiet words of encouragement. A few slipped folded bills into his paper cup without making a show of it. When the cafe finally closed, he stepped back into the cool night air. The street looked the same as always. The alley was still narrow. The bakery wall was still cold. But something inside him had shifted. For the first time in a long while, he did not feel invisible. He sat down on his blanket and looked at his hands under the streetlight. They were rougher now, a little worn, but steady, still capable. He flexed his fingers slowly, remembering the sound of the applause. Tomorrow might bring nothing, or it might bring something new. For now, he allowed himself a small, quiet hope. The broken piano had revealed more than music. It had revealed his story. And maybe, just maybe, that story was not finished yet. The next evening, he almost did not go. He woke up early, long before the bakery ovens started their morning work. For a few minutes, he lay still, staring at the thin line of light above the alley. He wondered if the night before had been real or just a kind dream that disappears in the morning. He flexed his fingers slowly. They were still steady. The memory of the applause came back clearly. The faces, the silence, the way the room had changed. Still, doubt tried to creep in. What if no one remembered? What if the cafe owner had only been polite? What if the crowd had simply been caught in a moment that would not return? He sat up and brushed off his blanket. The street was quiet. A delivery truck passed in the distance. The city looked the same as always. But he felt different. He walked to a public restroom a few blocks away and washed carefully. He cleaned his hands longer than usual. He trimmed his beard again, making sure it looked neat. He adjusted his shirt and jacket as best as he could. They were still worn, but he made sure they were clean. When he returned to his usual corner in the afternoon, he noticed something new. The broken piano was gone. For a second, his heart dropped. Had they thrown it away? Had they decided the joke was over? But then he saw it. The upright piano from inside the cafe had been moved closer to the front window. This wood was polished, not perfect, but cared for. A small sign now sat on top of it. "Live music tonight." He stared at the words. Underneath, written in smaller letters, were two simple words. "Special guest." He looked around, unsure. The cafe owner stepped outside and spotted him immediately. "You came," the owner said with a warm smile. He nodded slowly. "You meant it." "Of course I did," the owner replied. "We've had people asking about you all day." As if to prove the point, a young man from the night before walked by and raised a hand in greeting. "See you tonight," he called out. He was not used to people greeting him like that. The hours before evening passed slowly. Word had spread. A short video clip from the night before had already begun circulating online. People were sharing it, commenting in surprise. Some were calling it inspiring. Others simply wrote, "Wow." He did not fully understand how quickly things could travel through phones and screens. But he could see the effect in real life. By the time the sun began to set, more people than usual gathered outside the cafe. Some held coffee cups. Some held phones. Some simply stood with curiosity. He remained near the doorway, unsure where exactly he was supposed to stand. The cafe owner approached him again. "You'll play 2 short sets," he explained gently. "No pressure. Just play what you feel. No pressure." The words were kind, but the crowd outside suggested otherwise. He looked through the window at the upright piano. It was not perfect. A few scratches marked the surface. But it was in tune. Whole. Stable. He stepped inside. The room was already full. People who had laughed the night before were now seated quietly, waiting. Others had never seen him before but had heard about the story. The cafe owner tapped a glass lightly to get attention. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "Last night, something unexpected happened. Tonight, we wanted to give him the space he deserves." All eyes turned toward him. He felt the familiar rush of nerves, the same feeling he had known years ago before stepping onto small stages. But this time it felt mixed with gratitude. He walked to the piano and sat down. The bench was steady. The keys were smooth under his fingers. He placed his hands gently on them and closed his eyes for just a second. When he began to play, the difference was clear. The sound filled the room fully. Rich, balanced, clear. There were no broken notes to avoid this time. His fingers moved freely across the keys, not carefully, but confidently. The melody flowed without interruption. The music rose and fell naturally, like breathing. The crowd sat completely still. Even those holding phones lowered them slightly, realizing that watching through a screen could not capture the full feeling in the room. He allowed himself to explore deeper passages now, pieces he had not dared to play on the broken piano. Fast runs, soft transitions, strong chords that echoed gently off the walls. He was not playing to impress. He was playing because he loved it. Halfway through the first piece, something unexpected happened. People began to close their eyes, not out of boredom, but to feel it better. The cafe that had once been loud and full of chatter now felt almost sacred. When he finished the first piece, the applause came quickly and warmly. Not shocked this time, certain. He nodded in thanks and began the second piece without speaking. This one carried more emotion. It told a quiet story without words. It spoke of loss but also of endurance, of long nights and steady hands, of silence that never fully erased music. A woman near the front wiped her eyes openly now. The young girl from the night before sat on the floor near the piano, watching every movement of his hands. When he finished, the applause was louder than before. Some people stood. The cafe owner approached him again. "We've had calls," he said quietly. "A small community theater wants to know if you would play at their event next month. And a music teacher reached out this morning. She wants to speak with you." He blinked slowly. Calls? Events? He had not expected anything beyond this small room. The owner placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to decide now, but doors are opening." Doors. It had felt like every door in his life had once closed. Now even one opening felt overwhelming. The second set began shortly after. This time the crowd had grown even larger. Some people stood outside, listening through the open door. He played with ease now. Confidence returned not in arrogance, but in comfort. Between pieces, someone asked softly, "What's your name?" He paused. For months, he had not heard his own name spoken with respect. He answered quietly. The room repeated it gently, as if making sure to remember. By the end of the evening, the paper cup near the piano was filled, not just with coins, but with folded bills. But more than that, it was filled with something he had missed even more. Recognition. As the crowd slowly dispersed, many stayed behind to shake his hand. "Thank you," one person said. "No," he replied softly. "Thank you." When the cafe finally emptied and the lights dimmed, he stepped back outside into the cool night air. The alley was still there. The bakery wall was still rough. But he no longer felt like he belonged only to that narrow space. The city looked different, not because it had changed, but because he had been seen. For the first time in a long while, he felt something steady and strong growing inside him. Not just hope, direction. The broken piano had been the beginning. Tonight had been proof. His story was moving forward again. And this time he was ready to follow it. The week that followed did not feel real. For a long time, his days had been simple and predictable. Wake up, find food, sit near the cafe, listen to music through open doors, sleep in the alley, repeat. Now each morning brought something new. The video from the broken piano had spread further than anyone expected. People from other neighborhoods began visiting the cafe just to see him play. Some recognized him on the street and greeted him with a smile instead of a quick glance away. It was not fame. It was something quieter. It was respect. The cafe owner kept his promise. Every evening, the upright piano stood ready near the front window. A small sign with his name written neatly beneath live music stayed on top. Customers came early to find seats. But the biggest change happened 3 days later. The community theater that had called earlier invited him to visit. It was not a large building. The paint on the outside walls was slightly faded. The sign above the door had seen better days. But inside, the stage lights were bright, and at the center of the stage stood a grand piano. He had not seen one up close in years. He walked toward it slowly, almost carefully, as if it might disappear if he moved too fast. "Go ahead," the theater manager said kindly. "Try it." His hands hovered above the keys for a moment. This was not a broken piano on a sidewalk. This was not even the cafe upright. This instrument was smooth, polished, perfectly tuned. The lid was open, ready to let the sound travel freely through the hall. He pressed one key. The sound rang out clear and full, filling the empty theater in a way that made his chest tighten. He pressed another, then another. Within seconds, his fingers were moving, not testing anymore, but playing. The music that came out was stronger than anything he had played in the cafe. Carried depth and power. It rose high into the theater ceiling and returned like an echo of everything he had been holding inside. The manager stood quietly at the side, watching with wide eyes. When he finished, the room felt charged, even though only 2 people were inside. "We would be honored to have you perform here next month," the manager said. He nodded slowly, still looking at the piano. That evening, as he walked back toward the alley, he realized something important. For the first time in years, he had somewhere to be. A date marked on a calendar. A reason to prepare. The cafe owner noticed the difference in him too. "You look lighter," the owner said one night after closing. He smiled slightly. "I feel like I'm walking toward something instead of away from everything." In the days that followed, small changes began to take shape. A local music teacher offered him temporary work helping with beginner students. Not full-time, not permanent, but a start. The teacher said, "They need someone who understands more than just notes." He agreed. The first time he sat beside a child at a piano again, guiding small hands to find the right keys, he felt something shift inside him. He was not just playing for applause anymore. He was sharing. The alley behind the bakery slowly became a place he visited less. The cafe owner arranged for him to stay in a small storage room upstairs for a while. It was simple, with a narrow bed and a small window, but it was warm and safe. On the first night he slept there, he lay awake for a long time, not because he was uncomfortable, but because it felt strange to have a door he could close. He realized then how much quiet strength it takes just to survive, and how much courage it takes to begin again. The night of the theater performance arrived sooner than expected. The seats were not completely full, but they were not empty either. Word had spread through the same small video that once showed him playing a broken piano. Before stepping on stage, he stood alone behind the curtain. He thought about the alley, the bakery wall, the broken keys, the laughter that turned into silence. If someone had told him a month earlier that he would stand backstage at a theater, preparing to perform again, he would not have believed it. The manager gave him a small nod. "It's time." He walked onto the stage slowly. The lights felt warm on his face. The audience applauded politely as he sat down at the grand piano. He placed his hands on the keys and paused. In that quiet pause, he did not feel fear. He felt gratitude. He began with the same melody he had first played on the broken piano outside the cafe. But this time it was fuller, stronger. clearer. Each note carried the memory of where it had started. The audience listened closely. Some recognized the tune from the video. Others heard it for the first time. As the music grew, he allowed himself to look up briefly. In the front row, he saw the cafe owner. Next to him, the young girl who had once sat on the floor near the upright piano. Further back, some of the same faces who had once laughed on the sidewalk. Now they were sitting quietly, proud. He played not just with skill but with story. Every soft passage carried the weight of cold nights. Every strong chord carried the strength it took to stand back up. When he finished the final piece, the applause filled the theater. It was louder than the cafe, louder than the street. But what moved him most was not the volume. It was the sincerity. People stood, not because they were surprised, but because they believed. He stood from the bench and gave a small bow. Not dramatic, just honest. Later that night, after the lights dimmed and the audience left, he walked outside the theater and looked up at the sky. The city lights still glowed. Cars still passed. Life had not turned into a fairy tale. He did not suddenly become rich or world famous. But he had something more important. He had his music back. He had his place back. And he had learned something he would carry with him forever. People are not their worst season. A broken moment does not mean a broken life. Sometimes all it takes is one chance. One listening room. One person willing to say, "Go ahead." Weeks later, he returned to the cafe on a quiet afternoon. The broken piano, repaired slightly but still imperfect, stood near the wall as a reminder. He ran his fingers lightly over its worn keys and smiled. It had been the beginning. A joke that became a doorway. A challenge that became a second chance. He sat down and played a soft melody, just for himself. No crowd, no phones, just music. And this time he knew something with complete certainty. No matter what happened next, no matter how life shifted again, the music inside him would never be taken away, because it had survived the silence. And so had he.